The fire took my storage unit and everything in it. My family thought it took the will too. The fire took every box I owned in one night. My brother took 90 seconds on the phone to decide it wasn't his problem. I'm Delphine Ashworth, 34, a structural engineer who spends her days finding the hairline crack that brings a whole building down before anyone else notices it's there. At 2 in the morning, I stood in a gravel lot behind a self-storage facility watching Unit 114 collapse into embers. Smoke was still in my hair when I called my parents. My father answered half asleep, irritated, and said the words I will never forget. Then a woman in a Navy windbreaker walked up, a fire investigator, and asked who had a key to that unit in the last 2 weeks because they'd found something in the debris. A few days later, in a quiet county office, what she lifted out of a sealed evidence bag made my stomach drop through the floor. And what I did with it 48 hours after that, none of them saw coming. Welcome back. If you've ever been the reliable one in your family and learned the hard way what that word actually costs, this story is for you. Stay to the end because it turns on one small, ordinary object that almost nobody would have noticed. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight and subscribe before we start. The fire crew was still cooling hose when the woman in the windbreaker found me. I was wrapped in a blanket a night shift attendant had dug out of his truck. My hands weren't shaking, which surprised even me. 12 years of walking construction sites and reading stress fractures teaches your body to go quiet when everyone else is falling apart. She introduced herself as Marguerite Oilaron, County Fire Marshal's office, and she didn't use the soft voice people reach for around victims. She had a notepad and steady eyes. She asked how long I'd rented the unit. For years, I told her. She asked if I'd been there recently. Not in weeks, I said. I'd been buried in a bridge inspection 2 counties over and the facility manager had called me at midnight. She wrote it all down, then crouched by the scorched roll-up door and photographed the same corner of the wreckage again and again. I followed her line of sight. She was shooting the back left corner where I kept a fireproof document case bolted to the concrete floor. Ms. Ashworth, she said, still crouched, do you keep anything flammable back in that corner? I told her no, that corner held paperwork, old blueprints, and family documents, nothing else. She nodded slowly, like the answer mattered more than I understood yet. A younger deputy walked over and murmured something I couldn't hear, and Oilaron's jaw tightened. She stood, brushed ash off her knees, and looked at me with an expression I recognize from job sites right before someone tells you a load-bearing wall has to come down. I'm going to need to talk to you again tomorrow, she said. Try to get some sleep if you can. I told her engineers don't really sleep during a crisis, we just wait for the next stress reading. She almost smiled. Then she looked back at that scorched corner one more time, and something in the set of her shoulders told me this wasn't going to be filed under bad luck. I didn't know it yet, but the corner that burned hottest was about to burn my family down with it. Before Oilaron, before any of it, I'd made the call every daughter makes. Standing in that gravel lot at 2 in the morning watching the last of 4 years of storage smolder, I did the thing you do without thinking. I called my parents. It rang 5 times. When my father, Walt Ashworth, finally picked up, his voice was thick with sleep and already sharpened with irritation because in our family being woken up was treated as a bigger offense than being burned out. Del, it's the middle of the night, he said. I told him the storage unit was gone, along with most of what I'd kept there since the divorce. There was a pause and I let myself hope for exactly one breath that he'd say get in the car, we're coming. Instead he sighed the sigh I'd heard my entire life, the one that meant I was being dramatic. Well, that's a shame, but honestly that's not really our problem tonight, he said. You should have had better insurance. Not our problem, you should have had better insurance. I stood there with soot in my throat and let those words land. In the background I heard my mother Renata ask something muffled, and then my father's voice changed, dropped the sleep, got careful. Del, he said, did you have any of Grandpa Otto's old papers in there, the estate stuff? I said I had to go, and I hung up before he could push further because the engineer in me had already flagged a load that didn't match the blueprint. My storage unit was ash. My history was gone. And the first thing my father worried about wasn't me, it was a stack of my late grandfather's paperwork. I filed that action away the way I file every anomaly and turned back toward the woman in the windbreaker. By 9 that morning I was at the Cedar Crest Inn off the interstate, a place that smelled like carpet cleaner and other people's cigarettes, filling out an insurance claim on a bedspread that had seen better decades. My phone rang. It was my brother Sila's, and he was talking before I even finished saying hello. Oh my God, Del, are you okay? This is insane, he said, all in one breath. I told him I was fine, just tired. Then before I could finish a sentence about where I'd sleep that night, he pivoted. Listen, the metal box, he said. Grandpa's box with the deed stuff and the trust paperwork, did that survive? I sat up straighter. Sila's lived across town and hadn't set foot near my storage unit in over a year. He had no real reason to know I kept a fireproof case in that corner at all. I asked how he knew about it. He laughed a beat too fast and said Mom must have mentioned it. Then he said the sentence my family has used my whole life to excuse leaving me to handle everything alone. You'll figure it out, Del, he said warmly. You always do. You always do. It's engineered to sound like a compliment. It's actually a permit. It means we don't have to help her. She's capable, she'll manage, and I've been carrying that particular load-bearing phrase since I was 11 years old. I told Silas I had another call coming in. I just needed the room quiet enough to think. My storage unit had burned 12 hours earlier. My father wanted the papers. Now my brother wanted the papers. Nobody in my family had asked me a single real question about where I was going to sleep that night. That's when I stopped grieving and started paying attention. To understand why a stack of paper mattered more to my family than my actual safety, you have to go back 4 months to the week my grandfather died. Otto Ashworth was 86, and for the final year of his life I was the one who drove out every weekend, managed his medications, sat with him through the bad nights when his lungs gave him trouble. Silas visited twice. My parents came for holidays and left before the dishes were cleared. I didn't resent it at the time. Caring for him wasn't a favor I was keeping score of, but Otto kept score. About 2 months before he passed, he asked me to drive him to see an estate attorney named Priscilla Feld. He didn't tell me why. He just held my hand in the waiting room and said, "You showed up. I notice who shows up." 6 weeks after the funeral, Priscilla called the family together and read the updated will. The commercial building downtown that Otto had owned outright for 40 years, the one that housed his old hardware store and now brought in steady rental income worth somewhere north of $400,000, was left to me, not divided, not shared, to me. Silas stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. He said Otto wasn't in his right mind at the end. He said I'd manipulated a dying old man. My mother said we'd discuss it privately, which in our family means pressure the reliable one until she folds for the sake of quiet. What none of them knew was that I'd already been careful. Weeks earlier, I'd had the will notarized, had certified copies made, scanned every page into 3 separate cloud accounts, and stored the original somewhere it could never be casually reached. I'm an engineer. I document load calculations, tolerances, every variable that could cause a collapse. It's not paranoia, it's the habit that keeps buildings standing. It was about to keep the truth standing too. The building was in probate now, the hearing not far off. And my family wanted that paperwork gone. Then my storage unit, the place they assumed held every copy that mattered, caught fire. That afternoon I drove across town to my parents' house, not expecting comfort, but because the motel wanted a card I was trying to save for real expenses, and family is supposed to mean a spare room exists somewhere. My mother met me at the door and didn't open it all the way. Behind her the house was warm and lit and smelled like dinner. "Dell, we just don't really have the space right now," she said. I pointed out that my old bedroom was still, in theory, my old bedroom. She said they'd turned it into storage for Silas's kids' outgrown things, for a dozen small reasons that all added up to no. My father appeared behind her, hands in his pockets, and offered the sentence he uses to avoid every hard conversation. "You know how to land on your feet, kiddo." Then my mother said it again, softer, almost kind, which somehow made it worse. "It's really not our problem to solve, honey. You'll figure it out, you always do." Not our problem. Twice in one day, I stood on the porch of the house I grew up in and understood something with total clarity. They weren't cold because they were cruel. They were cold because being cold to me was free. I never made them pay for it. I always figured it out, always landed on my feet, always let them off the hook, so I did something I had never once done before. I stopped asking. "You're right," I said. "I'll handle it." And I meant it in a way she didn't hear coming. I drove back to the Cedar Crest, sat on that ugly bedspread, and opened a fresh document on my laptop. At the top I typed a single word: timeline. If my family wanted to make my crisis my problem alone, then I was going to solve it the way I solve every structural failure, completely, and with the receipts to prove it. The insurance adjuster came to the motel 2 days later, a tired woman named Odette with a clipboard and low expectations. Most storage fire victims, she told me, have nothing, no inventory, no receipts, no proof of what they lost. They stand in the ashes trying to remember things from memory and end up with pennies on the dollar. Then I opened my laptop, the one thing I'd had with me on the bridge site the night of the fire, and showed her the folder. Photographs of every shelf, dated receipts, a spreadsheet of stored items with serial numbers, because 2 years earlier I'd done a full inventory of that unit in one long weekend and never let it lapse. Odette looked at the screen, then at me, and her whole posture changed. "Honey," she said, "in 15 years I have never seen a claim documented this cleanly." That word again, documentation. My family had always treated my careful habits as fussiness, the boring quirk of a woman with no life. Odette treated them as the difference between being made whole and being left with nothing. She flagged the claim to move fast. Then, almost as an afterthought, she frowned at her paperwork. "Just so you're aware," she said, "the fire marshal's report lists the cause as undetermined, pending investigation. It's not marked accidental." I asked what that meant. She said carefully that accidental fires close quickly and pending investigation usually means somebody in that office isn't satisfied it was an accident. She gathered her things and left me sitting with that phrase. I thought about Marguerite Eulerin crouched in the ash, photographing my document corner from 6 angles. I thought about my father's careful voice asking about Grandpa's papers, and I opened my timeline and added a new line in the same flat language I used to log a structural anomaly. Cause of fire, not accidental. Everything after that I wrote down. Eulerin called on the 3rd day and asked me to come to the county building. She had a diagram laid out on a wide table, a floor plan of the storage unit marked in red and orange and hard black lines. She didn't waste time. Ms. Ashworth, I've been doing this 19 years, she said. I follow a national protocol for determining cause, NFPA 921. It keeps me honest. She tapped the diagram. In an accidental fire, she explained, you usually find a clear ignition source, wiring a battery, something electrical, and the burn spreads outward in a pattern that tells a coherent story. My fire didn't tell that story. It had a single point of origin low in the back left corner near the document case, nowhere near any outlet or wiring run. The burn pattern there was deep and localized, the kind you get when an accelerant is poured rather than sparked. She said lab samples were out for confirmation, but she already knew roughly what they'd find. I asked her to say it plainly, the way I ask contractors to say things plainly. She looked at me and did. Someone set this deliberately, Ms. Ashworth, against the wall where you kept your paperwork. The room went very quiet. I've stood on a site and watched a load calculation come back wrong and felt the floor of my certainty drop out from under me. And I recognized that same feeling arriving in my chest, but I didn't let it show because the engineer in me had already moved to the next question, the practical one. Eulerin asked it before I could. So here's what I need to know, she said, pen ready. Who had access to that unit in the past 2 weeks? I opened my mouth to say only me, and then I remembered and my stomach turned to ice because the answer was not only me. I made myself answer in order, no emotion, the way I read out a stress report. The facility had a master gate code standard for any complex. I had my own, and then there was the spare access card. 10 days before the fire, my sister-in-law Priya, married to Silas, had called me, warm and casual, asking if she could borrow my storage access card to grab an old crib she remembered me storing there for a friend who was expecting. It had struck me as slightly odd even then, since I hadn't spoken to Priya in months. I told Eulerin the truth that I'd hesitated because I didn't actually recall storing any crib, but she'd insisted she remembered it clearly, and I was exhausted and behind on a work deadline, and I let it go. I handed her the spare card from the drop box by the office. Eulerin wrote her name down and underlined it. Then I told her the part that made my own hands go still. 4 days before the fire, something about the whole exchange had nagged at me enough that I'd called the facility to request a full access code reset on my unit quietly to get that spare card out of circulation. A feeling I couldn't name had been sitting on my chest for days. The reset was scheduled to take effect in 2 days. The fire came the night before it was set to go through. Eulerin stopped writing and looked at me for a long moment. So you sensed something was wrong, she said, and you moved to protect yourself. You just didn't have enough runway. That was exactly it. I'd seen the anomaly, I'd acted on it, and whoever set this fire had simply moved faster than a facility's scheduling department. I asked Eulerin what my sister-in-law could possibly have wanted with access to my unit. She said that was the whole question, wasn't it, and told me not to contact her yet. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the motel bed doing what I always do when a project is failing, running the whole sequence backward, looking for the detail I'd missed. Around 2 in the morning it surfaced. The camera. The facility had a single security camera mounted above the office door, angled down the main row that included my unit. I'd walked past it 100 times without thinking about it. If Priya had used that card, the camera had seen her do it. I called the facility manager the second his line opened, and the news was a race against a clock. The system, he told me, only retained footage for 10 days before it recorded over itself. The fire had been 5 days earlier, which meant the night before it was still on the server barely, but it would start getting over it within days. He hedged, said pulling footage was really a police matter, that he didn't want liability, that maybe I should wait for a formal request. I told him, in the calm flat voice I use with contractors trying to cut a corner, that a criminal investigation was already open, that Marguerite Eulerin's name was attached to it, and that we lost the footage because we waited was not a sentence either of us wanted to explain to a judge. He went quiet, then said he'd meet me at the office. I drove the 14 miles from the motel at 4 in the morning with the heater running and my jaw set. He was waiting in a fleece jacket, and together we sat at his little monitor and scrubbed backward through timestamps toward the night before my life burned. My hand was steady on the mouse. It was the rest of me that wasn't. We preserved the footage that morning, copied it to a drive, and handed the original chain of custody to Oil Aaron untouched, exactly as she told me to. I didn't watch all of it right there in the office. I made myself wait and do it properly. But that same afternoon, my sister-in-law made a mistake that told me more than any camera ever could. Priya texted me, working the concerned family member angle, and got chatty. She wrote that she'd heard the fire started over by my document case in the corner, and wasn't that strange, and had I lost all of Grandpa Otto's paperwork in there. I read it 3 times. I had never told my family where in the unit the fire started. Oil Aaron had been explicit that the point of origin was being withheld from everyone outside the investigation, my family included, specifically so no rumor could contaminate the case. A couple of first responders might have their own guesses, but none of them knew Priya, and Priya had sworn repeatedly she'd had no contact with anyone from the investigation. It didn't prove she'd struck the match, but there was no innocent way for her to know which corner had burned first, and she just put it in writing. A year earlier, I might have called her screaming. Even 6 months earlier, I might have called my mother in tears asking how this could possibly be happening. But something in me had gone very still and very clear. I didn't accuse her. I didn't tip my hand. I wrote back something soft and vague, thanked her for checking in, said the investigation was ongoing. Then I screenshotted her message, logged the date and time, and forwarded it to Oil Aaron with one line: "She knows where it started." Oil Aaron wrote back within the hour, "Interesting, keep everything, don't engage." I set the phone down and caught my own reflection in the dark motel window, and for the first time in a long time I looked like someone who was not about to fold. My family had spent my whole life betting I'd stay quiet. They had bet wrong. The next piece came from the last place I expected, at the last event I wanted to attend. A great uncle of ours passed that same week, and the family gathered at a funeral home 2 towns over. I went because Otto would have wanted me there, and because I've learned people say the truest things while holding a paper plate of deli sandwiches. I stayed near the edges of the room. That's where Silas's neighbor, a chatty man named Dwayne who does small engine repair out of his garage, found me by the coffee urn. He didn't know any of the backstory. He just wanted conversation, and he mentioned, laughing, that Priya's husband Silas had borrowed his gas can a couple weeks back and returned it bone dry. Told him he could have at least topped it off, Dwayne said, chuckling. Guy borrows a full can, brings it back empty. What's he doing with all that gas? His lawn's the size of a postage stamp. I kept my face pleasant and my voice light and asked exactly when that was. Dwayne thought about it and named the week of the fire. I thanked him, refilled coffee I didn't want, and stepped outside to the parking lot to breathe. Gasoline, a borrowed can returned empty. The same week my storage unit burned from a poured accelerant. I didn't have a recording, and I didn't need one. I had a witness who'd tell the truth without knowing what he'd witnessed. I called Oil Aaron from the funeral home lot. She listened, quiet, then told me the lab had come back that very morning. Samples from the document corner were positive for a gasoline range accelerant. Everything was pointing in one direction now, and the arrow ran straight through my brother's household. The next morning I drove to the bank downtown and went into the safe deposit vault because it was time to hold the thing they thought they'd destroyed. When Otto asked me to keep his papers safe, I hadn't put them in my storage unit. I'd put the originals here, behind a steel door and a key only I held. The clerk led me to a private room, set the long metal box on the table, and left me alone. I opened it. On top sat the original will, notarized, embossed, the raised seal crisp under my thumb, leaving the building on Cutler Street to me in language no fire could smudge. My family had spent a week clawing for these papers. They'd burned my storage unit believing the will was inside, and here it sat, untouched, cool under my hand, more real than ever. But that wasn't what stopped my breath. Underneath the will was an envelope with my name on it in Otto's shaky handwriting, a letter I'd never seen, sealed the day he signed. I opened it there in that quiet little room. He wrote that he knew exactly what would happen once he was gone. He wrote that he'd watched his own son, my father, spend a lifetime keeping the peace by feeding me to my brother's expectations, and that he was sorry he hadn't put a stop to it sooner. Then he wrote the line I carried through everything that followed. If they fight you for the building, don't shrink. You were the one who showed up. The fire had burned my copy. It had never come near the original, and it had never come anywhere near what my grandfather had already seen coming about his own family. I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I slid the will and the letter into a folder, signed the vault log, and walked back out into the daylight with my spine straight. They had a key to my storage unit. I had the one thing they could never reach. Sitting in my car outside the bank, I let myself feel the full weight of the choice in front of me. There were 2 roads. The quiet one was to say nothing, let the probate hearing come, present the original will, take the building, and walk away while the criminal case ground along somewhere in the background without me attached to it publicly. It would be clean. It would be safe. It was exactly what my family expected, because keeping the peace was the family religion and I'd been raised inside its walls. The other road was harder. It meant fully cooperating with Oil Aaron, handing over every screenshot and timeline and witness, letting the arson case and the probate case arrive at the same moment in the same courtroom in the open with everyone watching. It meant my sister-in-law might go to prison. It meant my parents would learn that the daughter they'd counted on staying silent had been documenting every step the entire time. For most of my life, I would have chosen the quiet road. It's the one that keeps a family together, or at least keeps the appearance of it, which we'd always treated as the same thing. But I thought about Otto's line, "Don't shrink, you were the one who showed up." Peace built on my silence had never actually been peace. It had just been my family's comfort, paid for out of my share. I started the car and called Oil Aaron, told her I was in completely, whatever the case needed from me. She said good, that most people took a while to decide, and most of them decided to look away. I told her I'm an engineer, I don't look away from a structural problem, I find out exactly what's failing and why. Then I drove back to the motel and started organizing everything I had, because finishing this properly was going to take all of it. My mother called that evening, and her voice had shifted into the careful, sweetened tone she saves for when she wants something. She asked how I was holding up, then didn't wait for an answer. She got straight to it. "Dell, I've been thinking," she said. "Did you ever find any of Grandpa's papers after the fire, the will, all that? Because if it's really gone, well, maybe that's just the universe telling us to split the building evenly and move on." I held the phone and listened to my mother suggest that my grandfather's dying wish going up in smoke would be a convenient gift. I said the investigation was ongoing and I couldn't discuss it. She pressed, and then she made the mistake that told me exactly how deep this ran. Trying to sound sympathetic, she said, "Priya told me your unit was always such a mess, boxes everywhere, no wonder it caught." I went very still. Priya had told everyone repeatedly that she'd never once been inside my unit, that she'd only borrowed the access card from the drop box and never gone past the office. But my mother had just described the interior layout in Priya's own words. "You can't describe the inside of a place you never entered." Somewhere between the two of them, a story had a hole in it, and I just watched my mother fall straight through it. I kept my voice even and asked when Priya had actually been inside. My mother backpedaled instantly, said she must have meant from years ago, changed the subject to the weather. But it was too late. I hung up and added the line to my timeline. Mother describes interior of unit in Priya's words. "My family wasn't just leaving me to burn. Some of them had known exactly where the match was." Oilern asked me to come in again, and this time a detective sat with her, a woman named Castellano with kind eyes and a hard mouth. They walked me through how a case like this gets built to hold up in court, the accelerant lab work, the sealed evidence, the chain of custody that means nobody can later claim tampering. Then Oilern said they'd recovered a personal item from the point of origin, something that survived the fire because it was metal, and they needed me to identify it. Castellano set a sealed evidence bag on the table. Inside was a keychain, warped and darkened by heat but unmistakable, a small enamel compass on a ring, the paint bubbled but the shape entirely intact. My whole body went cold, the real kind, the kind that could name this whole story. I knew that keychain. I'd bought it. 3 summers earlier, on a trip up the coast, I'd bought 2 matching compass keychains from a lighthouse gift shop, one for me and one for Priya, back when we still made an effort with each other, back when we used to joke about always finding our way back no matter how lost we got. I'd given her hers for Christmas that year. She'd put her spare keys on it. And here it was, melted into the exact corner where someone had poured gasoline and set fire to my history. Oilern watched my face and didn't rush me. "Ms. Ashworth," she said quietly, "do you recognize this?" I told her yes, whose it was, how I knew where I'd bought it. My voice didn't shake, though everything underneath it did. What she'd found at the scene, the thing that made my blood run cold, was a small compass I'd given my sister-in-law to remember a good week when we still liked each other. Castellano asked if I was certain. I was. There was no other compass keychain in the world that would end up melted into the corner of my storage unit. I could have sat in that room and come apart. Instead, I did what I do when a structural report comes back wrong. I narrowed down to the next correct action. I gave them the story of the keychain, the gift shop receipt still buried in an old email, the Christmas I'd handed it over. I gave them the dates, the texts, the funeral home tip about the gas can. I did not call Priya to scream at her. I did not call my mother to demand answers. My weapon was never going to be my voice raised in a parking lot. It was going to be a clean, patient record a judge could actually read. Oilern told me they had enough now to bring Priya in for formal questioning, and that the case would move to the prosecutor. Then she asked gently whether I wanted to warn my family, prepare them somehow. I thought about it and decided no. Not because I wanted an ambush, but because every time I'd tried to handle things privately with my family, they'd used that privacy to pressure me into silence. This time, the truth was going to arrive somewhere they couldn't manage it, couldn't spin it, couldn't decide it wasn't their problem. It was going to arrive in a courtroom on the record with a judge and a fire investigator and the whole family sitting in the gallery. I asked when the probate hearing was scheduled. She checked, 6 days out. Both cases, the fire and the will, were about to breathe the same air in the same room. Priya must have felt the ground shifting because she went on the offensive the only way she knew how, with her mouth. Over the next few days, my phone lit up with calls from relatives I Hadn't heard from in years, each one repeating a version of the same story. Priya was telling the whole family I'd manipulated a dying old man into changing his will, that I'd isolated Otto during his last year so I could work on him, that I was cold and calculating and had probably been careless enough to burn my own storage unit chasing an insurance payout. An aunt actually asked, in a syrupy voice, whether I'd considered how all of this looked. My sister-in-law's weapon was gossip and public shame, the family court of whispers where she'd always won because nobody had ever fought back. She was good at it, she'd had years of practice. And she was betting I'd do what I always did, go quiet, go small, let the story harden around me because defending myself felt like making a scene. I wasn't playing that game anymore. Gossip lives in the dark and dies in the light, and I was about to turn on every lamp in the building. I didn't argue with a single relative, I didn't send one defensive text. I said calmly to anyone who asked that everything would be clear at the hearing and that I hoped they'd come. I meant it. I wanted witnesses. She thought she was building a case against me, she was building an audience for herself. 3 days before the hearing, I met with Priscilla Feld, my grandfather's attorney, in her small office that smelled like old books and toner. I needed to know if the will could hold because Priya's whole public story rested on one claim, that Otto hadn't been in his right mind. Priscilla listened without changing expression, then opened a file and laid my worries to rest one by one. The updated will, she said, had been executed properly, signed in front of 2 independent witnesses, neither of them me, neither of them family. That had been intentional, and there was more. Priscilla had insisted when Otto first came to her on documenting capacity thoroughly. On the day of the signing, Otto had been evaluated by his own physician of over 15 years, who'd signed a statement confirming he was of sound mind and fully understood what he was doing. That statement was in the file, dated and notarized. The manipulation story didn't just have a weak leg, it had none at all. Then Priscilla told me the thing that closed the door completely. Her office kept an independent copy of the executed will in their own records, standard practice entirely separate from mine. Even if every copy I owned had burned, even if the original had somehow been destroyed too, the will existed in a lawyer's vault that no borrowed access card could ever reach. My sister-in-law had set a fire to erase a document that lived in 3 places she'd never even considered. Priscilla looked at me over her glasses and said, in the dry voice of someone who's watched families do their worst, "Ms. Ashworth, whoever burned your unit to destroy this will made a very expensive mistake." I told her I was starting to think a lot of my family had underestimated the cost of underestimating me. The night before the hearing, my father did something he never does. He came to me. He drove out to the Cedar Crest alone, stood in the doorway of my motel room looking older than I'd ever seen him, and asked if we could talk. I let him in. He sat on the edge of the desk chair, turning his cap in his hands, and for a moment I thought I was finally going to get the apology I'd waited 34 years to hear. He got close. He said he knew things had been hard on me, that maybe they hadn't always been fair, that I'd carried more than my share with Otto. My throat tight. Then he ruined it. "So I'm asking you," he said, "for the family, don't make this bigger than it has to be tomorrow. Whatever's going on with the investigation, let's keep it quiet. Silas has the kids to think about. Your mother couldn't take it. Just take the building if that's what Otto wanted and let the rest go." There it was, not an apology, a negotiation. He'd driven all that way not to stand with me, but to ask me one more time to swallow it for everyone else's comfort. I looked at my father and didn't feel angry. I felt something quieter and more final, the way you feel when a long fever finally breaks. I told him I loved him. I told him I'd spent my whole life keeping things quiet for this family, and that quiet had never once protected me, only them. I told him that tomorrow the truth was going to be told, all of it, and that he could sit with me or sit across from me, but it was happening either way. He put his cap back on and left without another word. That same night, Eulerin called with an update that turned every scattered piece into a single picture. The investigation had crossed the line from suspicion into a built case. The hallway camera footage we'd raced to save showed a figure entering the facility the night before the fire. It wasn't a clean image, grainy and dim the way cheap security cameras always are, but it caught her height, her build, the long na. By coat she wore every single season, and in one frame as she glanced up near the office camera, enough of her face. On its own, Eulerin admitted a good defense attorney could pick at it. Combined with everything else, it stopped being one grainy figure and became her. Phone records placed Silas's cell near the storage facility that same night, nowhere he had any reasonable business being. The gas can was documented. The accelerant lab was positive. And the melted compass keychain sat in an evidence locker with my sister-in-law's name attached to every link of its chain. Eulerin told me they'd brought Priya in that afternoon for formal questioning, and Priya, being Priya, had done the one thing guaranteed to sink her. She denied everything flatly, angrily looked a detective in the eye, and said she had never once set foot inside that unit. Never, not to borrow anything, not for any reason. She'd built her entire defense on never having entered it, except my mother had already described its interior in Priya's own words, and the hallway camera had already watched her walk through the gate. She'd sealed the hole in her own story shut with herself inside it. Eulerin said the prosecutor was preparing charges, arson and insurance fraud among them, and expected it to move within days. I asked her one thing. Would she be willing to attend the probate hearing as a witness if the judge allowed it? She was quiet for a second, then said she'd already planned to be there. Some cases, she said, you want to see land in person. I hung up and actually slept for the first time since the fire. Tomorrow, everything I'd written down was going to be read out loud. I saw Priya once before the hearing and it nearly undid me, which I think is worth telling you about. I arrived early at the county courthouse and she was already there, alone on a bench in the cold marble hallway, and for a moment she didn't notice me. Her kids were down the corridor with a cousin and Priya was staring at a piece of paper in her lap. Even from across the hall I could read the header on it, a foreclosure notice. My sister-in-law was about to lose her own house, the actual roof over her actual children, and somewhere in that terror she decided the answer was to burn whatever stood between her and safety. I understood her for one terrible aching moment completely. She wasn't a cartoon villain. She was a drowning woman who'd grabbed the nearest thing to push herself back to the surface. I almost went to her. I almost sat down and said we could figure something out, that no building was worth this, that we used to be close once. Then she looked up and saw me, and whatever softness had been on her face curdled instantly into something hard and hissing. You should have just let it go, she whispered, low enough that the echoing hall wouldn't carry it. You always have to be so perfect. This is your fault too. The ache in my chest closed like a fist. I felt sorry for her. I did. But being sorry for someone doesn't erase what they've done, and understanding a fire doesn't unburn what it took. I gave her a small nod, the kind you give someone past saving, and walked into the courtroom to take my seat. Inside, I set my folder on the table in front of me, squared it to the edge the way I square everything, and made my final decision about how this would go. I still had a choice even now. I could hand the judge the will quietly, let probate do its narrow work, and keep the fire entirely out of this room, saving the arson case for some later courtroom nobody in my family would bother attending. Priscilla had even offered to keep the two matters cleanly separate. But I'd thought about it all week, and I knew the truth needed to land here in front of these specific people, not as an ambush, but as a reckoning conducted properly by the rules. My whole family had come, drawn in by Priya's whisper campaign, filling the benches, ready to watch the greedy sister-in-law get what was coming to her. My mother sat beside Priya, chin up, cert. My father sat 2 rows back, alone, hat in his lap. Marguerite Oilerin sat quietly near the aisle in a clean navy jacket, a folder of her own on her knee. I hadn't arranged anything theatrical. I had simply made sure that every thread, the will, the capacity evaluation, the fire report, the witnesses, would be available in this room through proper channels, all on the record if the moment called for them. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to make a scene. I was going to answer every question truthfully and let the facts do what facts do once you finally stop hiding them. The bailiff called us to order. The judge, a gray-haired woman with reading glasses and no patience for theater, opened the probate file, and I folded my hands on top of my grandfather's will and waited for the door to open. The hearing began the way these things do, dry and procedural, and my sister-in-law sat through it with a small, confident smile, because she believed she'd already won the only battle that mattered. In her mind, the will had burned in my storage unit. She'd made sure of it. She thought this hearing would come down to her word against mine about what Otto had wanted, a whisper contest, her favorite kind, with my mother nodding along and the family stacked on her side. Her attorney, a man in a slightly too shiny suit, opened by claiming the decedent's most recent will could not be produced, that the only known copy had been lost in a fire, and that the estate should therefore be distributed under the prior will, which split everything evenly. He said it smoothly, like a man laying down a winning card. Across the room, I watched my mother's shoulders relax. I watched Priya's smile widen slightly. The judge looked over her glasses and asked the question the whole day turned on, the same one I'd been waiting for. Is the original of the most recent will available to this court, or is it not? Priya's attorney said with theatrical regret that it was not, that it had unfortunately been destroyed. My sister-in-law let out a small breath. Relief, victory, the tension going out of her like she'd crossed a finish line. She turned her head and gave me a look I will remember for the rest of my life. A look that said you should have just let it go. I met her eyes and didn't look away and didn't smile. I reached into my folder. Priscilla rose beside me and said the words that changed the temperature of the entire room. Your Honor, the original will is available. We have it here. I stood and set my grandfather's original will on the table where the light from the tall windows fell across the raised notary seal, and the room went quiet enough that I could hear the clock on the back wall. Priscilla carried it to the bench. The judge examined it, turned the pages, ran her thumb over the embossed seal exactly as I had in the vault, and said, "This appears to be a properly executed original." Then Priscilla set beside it a second document, her office's independently retained copy, and the capacity evaluation signed by Otto's physician on the day of the signing, and the notarized statements of the 2 independent witnesses. One clean, impossible to argue with stack, built months in advance. I watched my sister-in-law's face come apart in slow motion. The confidence drained out of it first, then the color, then something underneath both of those, a dawning, sickening understanding. The will she had burned my storage unit to destroy was sitting on a courtroom table, whole, its seal unmarked, because it had never been inside that unit in the first place. Her attorney leaned over and whispered something urgent, and she didn't seem to hear him. Somewhere behind me, a relative murmured, half to herself, "She always does land on her feet." This time it wasn't a dismissal. This time it came out closer to awe, and I let it settle over the room. I didn't gloat. I kept my voice flat, and even when the judge asked me to confirm the chain of custody, and I explained simply that I'm an engineer, that I document everything, that I'd had the will notarized and secured in a bank vault months before Otto passed because he'd asked me to keep it safe. Plain facts, plainly stated. My mother had gone white beside Priya. My father, 2 rows back, had his eyes closed. And Priya was staring at the will like it was a living thing that had crawled out of the ashes she'd made, which in a way it had. But we weren't done, because the will only explained the why. It didn't explain the fire, and Marguerite Oylerin was already rising from her seat by the aisle. Priya's attorney, drowning now, tried to change the subject the only way he had left, by attacking the source. He argued that the will's existence didn't prove Otto's true intent, that my caregiving had given me undue influence, that a vulnerable elderly man had been isolated and worked on by the very person standing to gain. It was Priya's whisper campaign dressed up in legal language, and for a second it hung in the air. Then Priscilla, unhurried, produced the physician's capacity evaluation again and read the relevant line aloud, that Otto Ashworth was of entirely sound mind and understood the full disposition of his estate, signed and dated the day of the signing by his own physician of 15 years. The undue influence story died right there on the record. Into that silence, the judge, having noticed the woman in the navy jacket, asked who she was. Oylerin stood and identified herself, County Fire Marshal's office, and said there was an active criminal arson investigation directly bearing on why this estate's most recent will had supposedly been lost in a fire. She was careful, the way someone who testifies for a living learns to be. She said the criminal matter would be tried in its own courtroom, not this one, and that she was present only so the record would reflect why it document everyone. Had been told burned by accident had in fact been deliberately targeted. The judge asked her to summarize the basis, nothing more, and noted for the record that she was not trying the criminal matter today. Oylerin, in the flat, unbothered voice of someone who's done this 100 times, gave the court the shape of it, not the whole file. A single point of origin in the corner where I'd kept my paperwork. A confirmed accelerant. A witness caught on camera entering the facility the night before. A personal item recovered from that origin, later identified as belonging to Priya Ashworth. She set each fact down like a stone, plainly, and said the details would be proven where they belonged at a criminal trial. But the shape was enough. With every fact, the room seemed to lean further away from my sister-in-law. Benches of relatives who'd come to watch me shame now turning slowly to stare at her instead. My mother's hand had come up to her mouth. Priya had stopped breathing. And the story she'd built, the confident smile, the whisper court, the certainty that I would fold, collapsed inward all at once, and the woman who had lit the match finally understood that everything she'd tried to burn had survived her. Then she broke. She shot up from her chair so hard it screeched across the floor and toppled behind her, and every ounce of venom she'd hissed at me in the hallway detonated at full volume in that courtroom. "You think you deserve this," she screamed, pointing across the room at me, her attorney grabbing uselessly at her sleeve. "You always have to win, you always have to be the perfect one, the one who showed up. I have kids, I'm losing my house, and he left it all to you." Her voice cracked and climbed, and then she said the thing no amount of legal defense could ever pull back into her mouth. "It was supposed to be the building, not you. The building was supposed to burn, not you. None of this was supposed to touch you." The words hit the room like a dropped plate. It was supposed to be the building, not you. Her attorney was on his feet, talking over her, all but shouting for her to stop. The judge was calling for order, and none of it reached her. It wasn't a signed confession, and I had no doubt her attorney would spend the next year fighting to keep that outburst out of the criminal proceedings. It didn't need to be admissible to do its work in that room. The forensics would convict her without a single word from her own mouth. But in that moment, every relative who'd come to watch me shamed understood exactly what my sister-in-law had meant to burn and why. My mother lunged to pull her back down into her seat, hissing, "Priya, stop, be quiet," and in her panic she said too much herself. "We'll fix this just like we always do," and half the family heard the "we." I did not raise my voice. I've spent my career in rooms where structures fail and people panic, and I've learned that the calmest person in the room is the one everyone eventually listens to. I stood there steady while my sister-in-law came undone, and when the bailiff had moved to her side and the judge had called for order and the room had gone ringing and silent, I turned not to Priya but to my mother and said the only thing I'd been saving. You told me it wasn't your problem, I said, quiet enough that the whole room had to still itself to hear me. Turns out it was your daughter-in-law's crime and you knew where the match was. My mother's certainty finally cracked down the middle. Priya was weeping now, being walked toward the doors, and I picked my grandfather's will up off the table, the one that never burned, and held it against my chest the way his letter had told me to, and I did not shrink. The rest happened quickly, the way things do once the truth is finally in the room and there's nothing left to hold it back. The judge admitted the original will to probate on the spot and ruled the building on Cutler Street mine exactly as Otto had written it, the prior will set aside. She noted for the record the criminal matter oil Aaron had raised and directed it to proceed through proper channels, which it already was. Priya was formally arrested a week later, through the criminal process and not that courtroom, on charges of aggravated arson and insurance fraud. The fraud piece because it came out she'd also quietly filed a claim of her own, hoping to profit twice over. The case against her never rested on what she'd screamed at the hearing. It rested on the point of origin, the accelerant, the hallway footage, the melted keychain, and in the end on Sila's. His alibi fell apart under an hour of questioning, and facing charges of his own as an accessory, he told detectives everything: the borrowed gas can, the access card, the plan to destroy the will so the estate would split evenly and Priya's foreclosure could be stopped. My mother was never charged, though she spent a long afternoon explaining to Detective Castellano how she'd come to know the interior layout of my storage unit. There was no celebration, I want to be honest about that. I sat in my car in the courthouse lot afterward and felt no triumph, only a deep, aching quiet, the same quiet I feel standing on a site after a repair finally holds under load. My family had burned itself down trying to keep me small. I hadn't lit a single match. I'd only refused at last to hand them the water. In the months that followed, I took over the building on Cutler Street, the one Otto had owned for 4 decades, and did the thing he must have hoped I would do without ever quite saying it out loud. I renovated the ground floor into a small structural consulting office of my own, and turned the upstairs into affordable studio space for 2 young tradespeople just starting out, the way someone once gave my grandfather his first shot with nothing but a handshake. I hung Otto's photograph by the entrance so he could watch over the work. Priya's case moved through the courts. She took a plea and she'll be paying for that fire in more ways than one for a long time. I didn't attend the sentencing. Some things you sit with and some things you finally set down. My parents came by the building once near the holidays, standing outside the way I'd once stood on their porch. My mother asked if we could put it all behind us and be a family again. I didn't shut the door. I'm not built that way, and in the end, neither is an engineer, but I didn't fling it open either. I told them the door wasn't locked forever, but trust is something you rebuild load by load, not something you're owed by blood, and that I was done being the one who absorbed everyone else's stress so the whole structure could look stable from the outside. My mother started to say I'd always land on my feet out of habit and then stopped herself. Good, because I finally had the answer to that line, the one I'd been swallowing my whole life. You were right, I told her. I do land on my feet. I just stopped letting you knock me down first. Fire proves what's real. Paper burns, but the truth you took the time to document and the spine to finally say out loud doesn't. That's how quiet structural engineer outlasted the people who bet their whole lives she'd stay silent. The navy jacket, the compass keychain in the ash, the will that never burned. If your reliability has ever been used as the reason to leave you standing alone, write it down, say it out loud, and let them meet the version of you that's finally done carrying the whole load by herself. Subscribe if this one stayed with you, and I'll see you in the next story.